I too want to begin by not thanking Jeff. My role on this panel, as I see it, is to look at the issues raised by the other panelists from the point of view of someone teaching an interdisciplinary, probably undergraduate course on human rights, the concept and its history. Of course, one could easily devote a course to the topic under discussion, the relation between democracy and human rights, and we could spend days on the various models of democracy alone, as we've just seen. If I were lucky enough in teaching such a course to have guest lecturers like Daniel and Annette, I might hope to give the students a range of perspectives from various traditions on the topic. But I would have to figure out then what my job was, and I think my job would be to let them know that there has been no consensus among European and American thinkers that the two terms form some sort of natural pair, which seems to be the assumption that we're working on here, and that's the one I want to disrupt to begin with. I'd emphasize instead that the incongruities and incompatibilities between democracy and rights have been theorized by some of the brightest lights of Western intellectual history, from Montesquieu through Madison, J.S. Mill, de Tocqueville, Burckhardt, all the way up to contemporary philosophical, political philosophers like Rawls and Habermas. And I think I'd probably want to use some historical examples to give a sense of the modern lineage of these issues in the West and to explore the kinds of circumstances under which people become aware of systematic tensions between democracy and rights generally. For after all, the problem was apparent before the idea of human rights came into its own. And I think that I would also want to give them a sense of how political philosophers in the West have made a transition, really, over hundreds of years, from thinking about democracy as a problem for liberty, as a problem for rights, to thinking about the two of them as sort of implicating each other. So that has a history, and I think that if we leave out that history and just pick it up from the point of view of whether or not they implicate each other, as if there were that was some kind of eternal situation, that we're missing a lot. So since I am a Victorianist, I would probably choose two of the most famous liberal critics of democracy in the mid-19th century as my examples, John Stuart Mill and Alexis de Tocqueville. And I would want to look at the mid-19th century as a time when many liberals, and it's important to me at least that these are liberals, perceived a strong contradiction between extending popular participation in politics and protecting liberty of thought, expression, and action. And I am going to, just so that I don't confuse you, I recognize that I'm going to be sliding along a spectrum of terms here, from liberty, rights, to human rights sometimes. But thinking just in terms of, say, the 1850s for the time being, de Tocqueville and Mill looked across the Atlantic to the United States, and they saw a majority that often tyrannized over minorities, be they religious or racial. They enforced a narrow conformity of opinion and behavior. And in France, of course, by the mid-19th century, the record of democracy appeared just as worrisome. 3 popular insurrections, the First French Revolution, the July Revolution of 1830, and the Revolution of 1848, had all resulted in the people willingly ceding their sovereignty to autocratic individual rulers, Napoleon Bonaparte, Louis Philippe, and Louis Napoleon, respectively, who stifled dissent and constricted political channels. Louis Napoleon's 1851 coup, followed by the plebiscite that validated his rule and ended the Second French Republic, was a great blow to liberals on both sides of the Channel. Democracy, de Tocqueville and Mill and many others thought, must have some tropism toward tyranny and a kind of systematic antagonism toward liberty. So that's the way it looked in the late 1850s. Both de Tocqueville and Mill published books exploring those tendencies. De Tocqueville's Ancien Régime and the Revolution came out in 1856, and Mill's On Liberty in 1859. The two books give quite different analyses of the sources of the problem in democracy. Surprisingly, de Tocqueville traced French democratic illiberalism to the Ancien Régime rather than to the Revolution. To the Ancien Régime, when the absolute monarchy destroyed the local and regional autonomous governmental structures that had previously allowed for limited amounts of freedom under feudalism. It was, Tocqueville asserted, not only the policy of the monarchy to reduce hierarchy, equalize its subjects, and create uniformity, but also to isolate them from each other in an attempt to destroy competition for loyalty, identification, and effective power. So the absolute monarchy brought in a modernity, an early modernity, that was inimical to earlier forms of liberty. The revolution then and popular sovereignty exaggerated those very tendencies and increased homogeneity and class isolation, individual competition, and social antipathy. Mill's 1859 book focused less than de Tocqueville's on political institutions and instead approached democracy's problem from the perspective of what he called society. A nation might possess a perfectly free economy, universal education and franchise, and still not have liberty, Mill explained, because liberty rests not only on a lack of restrictions over empirical individuals, but also on the development within them of a quality he calls individuality. And it's individuality, not mere garden variety individuals who tend to lack this thing called individuality, that needed protection against the tyranny of the prevailing opinions and feelings, against the tendency of society to impose, I'm now Mill, by other means than civil penalties, its own ideas and practices as rules of conduct on those who dissent from them. Well, despite these differences, the two books often recur to the problem of the tyranny of the majority that de Tocqueville had identified 2 decades earlier in Democracy in America. Mill concisely restates this problem at the opening of On Liberty. The will of the people, this is Mill, practically means the will of the most numerous or the most active part of the people, the majority, or those who succeed in making themselves accepted as the majority. The people, consequently, may desire to oppress a part of their number, and precautions are as much needed against this as against any other abuse of power. Moreover, both men meant by the word democracy, and this is the important part, both men meant by the word democracy an entire habitus of equality that included nominal universal manhood suffrage, to be sure, but also extended far beyond into social, intellectual, religious, economic, and creative endeavors. So it's this idea of democracy as a kind of culture that I want to concentrate on in my remarks. This is what I think actually gives the swivel point for thinking of democracy and rights as co-implicated. Democracy, though, for them at that time, was what we now, as I said, call a culture, rather than just a political arrangement. And it was the illiberalism, they thought, of the totality of democratic habits, perhaps what Anat was referring to as democratic attitudes, manners, and institutions that they were analyzing. So the first question is then, what is a democratic attitude or a culture or a habit? Does it cut against rights normally? That was their question. De Tocqueville concentrated on democracy's disregard of plural and effective political participation, whereas Mill stresses its disregard for individuality. And yet the two books of the 1850s share that single analysis of why democratic culture fails to protect freedom. And this is how it looked again in the late 1850s. Democratic culture fosters conformity without reflection on the common good. It increases acquisitive individualism and competition while disdaining exceptional individuals. These are all little paradoxes. It prizes mediocrity and sameness while discouraging creativity and respect for unusual accomplishments. So although these tendencies lead to the consolidation of narrow-mindedness because dissenting voices are discouraged, although not necessarily outlawed, as well as to intellectual and political passivity. Moreover, the further down the social scale the democratic culture penetrates by virtue of franchise extension, the more intolerant of nonconformity the society would be likely to grow, and the more intent on homogeneity. So the problems, as they saw it in the mid-19th century, were not that democracy was foreign to some cultures, but that it was its own culture, which was considered inimical to rights. Both writers also stressed that their concerns were historical and empirical as much as theoretical, and both thought they were facing a future in which democracy would become the normal form of government, a development which they were not, given the alternatives, opposed to. The job of liberals in their time, they thought, was to lay the groundwork for the defense of individual and minority rights against intolerant, homogeneous majorities and their proxies. Faced with democracy's inevitable spread, liberals of the time applied themselves to the problem of how popular sovereignty and rights could be reconciled through all the things that we're so familiar with: constitutionalism, independent judiciaries, proportional representation, bicameralism, jury systems, bills of rights, rule of law. All of those things are the things that they are they are building in to the new kinds of democracies that they want to see. So they inaugurated many of the changes in the practice and theory of popular sovereignty that Annette is referring to when she says democracy properly defined, or what Mill himself is later going to talk about as true democracy, as opposed to false democracy, which is the tyranny of the majority. So this is a pivot point. That is recognizing the problems with popular sovereignty, having this discussion, thinking of the broad cultural implications. That is the pivot point for defining a new kind of democracy, which is going to be friendly to the idea of rights. So we are the beneficiaries, of course, of all of that thought, of that tradition of thought. We are the beneficiaries of the critique of democracy, because it's the critique of democracy that spawned the changes that have now allowed us to forget that there ever was a time when the phrase liberal democracy seemed to be an oxymoron. So it's that I want to try to revive so that we can understand the situation that we face now. Well, there's a host of obvious practical reasons for teaching our students about that time and the very difficult process of getting from there to here. We don't want them to take liberal democracy for granted, obviously, and de Tocqueville and Mill remind us of all the aspects of democratic culture in our own country as well as elsewhere that can still be turned against the rights of minorities. The old conundrum that if the majority of the people can confer rights, then they can also take them away, remains a real puzzlement. And our students encounter it frequently when studying contemporary nations in transition, but they ought to remember also that those same tensions are very much a part of our own democratic culture. So looking back to the mid-19th century also reminds us that we have no excuse, though it seems to me, for seeming naive about various kinds of democracies and their problems. We've been thinking about these issues for a couple of thousand years, and off and on, and we've been thinking continuously about them for a few hundred years. And so we can't honestly be surprised by the news that even in liberal democracies, voters are ill-informed and often believe they should vote on the basis of their self-interest narrowly defined and undiluted by any idea of the common good. So I'm actually not, Daniel, seeing in the critiques of democracy that you're raising something that's really very new. It seems to me that these are exactly the things that were said in the 1850s. So on the one hand, I would want the students to recognize that these are not problems confined to the past or to notions just now, or to nations, just now adopting democratic constitutions. On the other hand, it would be unrealistic to ignore the fact that long-established constitutional democracies do have a much better track record on human rights than do most nations. And that fact certainly implies the rather banal conclusion that the longer a nation struggles to reconcile democracy and rights, the better they get at it. And that's, I admit, that's a pretty banal conclusion. So to make that conclusion seem a little less banal, I think I want to stress the double-edged nature of de Tocqueville's and Mill's stress on what I'm calling a democratic culture, rather than just democracy as a mere mechanism for registering the empirical interests of social groups and individuals. The books of the 1850s I mentioned earlier see a cultural dynamic which can be opposed to liberty. They see democracy as that cultural dynamic, but their more basic vision is to see that popular sovereignty is a cultural dynamic, period. That is, the recognition that later allows Mill to become, and of course Tocqueville doesn't really survive the 1850s, so there's not any further development in his thinking, but allows Mill to become quite optimistic about liberal democracy in the later parts of his career. This conversion of Mill's becomes very clear in his subsequent work in the 1860s on democracy, which presents it as cultural and therefore deep, but also cultural and therefore interactive, intersubjective, changeable, and transformative of people. Like everyone in the Benthamite tradition, out of which Mill came, he rejected the idea of rights emanating either from natural law or from some founding social contract. That is, the foundation, he's an anti, or we could say at least a non-foundationalist in this regard. When he spoke of freedom and rights, he argued that they arose historically, and it was his hope that in the coming era of popular sovereignty, they would arise from deliberative processes inside nations. Of course, there's no other way to think about it, really, in the 19th century. So we're talking about processes inside of nations. In his writings of the 1860s on representation, on government, on the representation of intellect under a reformed franchise, the debate over the secret ballot, which of course he opposed, that is the secret ballot, not the debate, and on women's rights, which of course he supported, he turned his attention to theorizing and constructing such processes, which with a special emphasis, which always with a special emphasis on minimizing the desire for self-interest and maximizing a regard for the public good. He thought, therefore, that the best way to institutionalize and protect rights was to foster a different kind of democratic culture in which the political process was one among many practices, obviously, because it's a cultural process, of individual formation, or forming people. So it's one among many practices in which individuals are formed into people who are the subject of rights and who are also the donors of rights. So people who can respect the rights of others as well as exercise their own. If democracy makes cultures and thereby breeds certain kinds of people, it might be shaped, he thought, in such a way as to make a culture in which each citizen understands that his or her own rights can only be realized when all have similar freedoms. As one of the first to articulate this explicitly non-foundationalist, reciprocal, and deliberative model of establishing rights, Mill not only reconciled rights and democracy, but he also made them complementary principles. He, at that point, toward the end of his career, believed that they actually implied each other in very much the way that Anat is indicating. Well, we can see Mill as a forerunner of a much modern theory, especially theorists like Jürgen Habermas or Rainer Forst, who are themselves non-foundationalist thinkers who are interested in the intersubjective procedural popular sovereignty that Mill came to describe. I don't have time, but if I did, I would say that we can also, I think, see him as someone who helps us understand what popular sovereignty and democracy are doing in the UN Declaration. That they are there not so much, and I completely agree with Anat here, they are there not so much as just, democracy is there not so much as just another right on a kind of laundry list of rights. It's there more in the same way that the rule of law is there, as an assumption that you make about the kinds of cultures, about the polities that produce the kinds of cultures that are going to protect rights, that are going to be friendly toward them. So I think that counting the rights and arranging the rights in terms of the most important and the least important is less a good way to teach the UN Declaration than to figure out what the status of the rights is. That some of them really go to the question of how you remake polities, what kinds of polities are going to be the most secure, what kinds are going to be the most peaceful, what kinds are going to be the ones in which you can foster individuals who are going to respect the rights of other individuals. So it has a slightly different status, I would say. Thank you very much.